Hey, what's up? It's Bon. Let's talk about Game of the Year. And what we're going to talk about is whether or not Tears of the Kingdom already has it locked up. Games I think could genuinely compete with it, and whether or not I think that's actually going to happen. If you like talking about Game of the Year, if you like video game news, speculation, and reviews, please subscribe to this channel, like this video if you do, and leave a comment down below with what you think. So Tears of the Kingdom released just a few days ago. It has a Metacritic score of 96. I think as some more reviews come out, I wouldn't be surprised if it drops a point maybe, but it's not going to drop much. That's where it's at. Nintendo was pretty selective with who they gave review codes to, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if we see some reviews come in a hair lower if they weren't assumed to be as friendly to the game as most of them were that got codes early. But this game has so many 5 out of 5s or 10 out of 10s, and like 9 out of 10s and stuff like that. It's going to be hard to knock this score down. So let's just assume it's going to stay at 96. That is, I believe, 1 point lower than Breath of the Wild, which for a sequel is pretty darn good. It's not uncommon for sequels to not quite live up, and it seems like this one has. And I've already seen lots of talk of this game being better than Breath of the Wild and basically every measurable way by a lot of people playing. So what does that mean for Game of the Year? We have a similar situation to last year where we had Elden Ring and God of War Ragnarok, and similar in the sense that Elden Ring came out fairly early in the year and was basically everyone's assumed Game of the Year and winner of most of the big awards from most of the large publications. But then people knew God of War Ragnarok was coming and knew that that was going to obviously compete pretty well. Now, if you only look at one metric for Game of the Year being the Game Awards by Jeff Keighley, if I remember correctly, God of War Ragnarok swept most of the awards, and then Elden Ring got Game of the Year. I don't think this is going to be a similar year. I think that this year is going to be Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom being the clear front runner in most people's heads, with like 5 or 6 or maybe more games right behind it. Now, I actually don't, when I look at the list, and we'll talk about it, when I look at the list of games that have already released, I think we'll be in that conversation for Game of the Year, and I look at the games that are still yet to come this year, I don't expect any of them to get a higher Metacritic score. That doesn't necessarily mean they won't have a chance of winning. I think they will. What I think is most interesting is it's probably going to really depend on what metric you use to determine what Game of the Year is for everyone. We already know that, the Game Awards is probably, for better or worse, has the most diversity in who votes on that. They poll basically, I believe it's dozens, if not hundreds, of relatively well-known publications that review games and stuff like that, magazines, websites, stuff like that, and they all have their own votes and they all submit, and that's how it goes. When you look at individual outlets, like say like Kinda Funny, who does their Game of the Year, it's often fairly easy to predict theirs, because theirs basically all that has to happen is, say a game like Tears of the Kingdom at Kinda Funny, if just a few of the people there don't play it, but everyone else loves it, if a game like that goes up against a game that everyone played and liked, there's a better chance of that game getting Game of the Year than the one that maybe people liked even more, but not as many people played it. So it all comes down to semantics, right? So Tears of the Kingdom taking the world by storm right now, highly anticipated, extremely successful sequel to what some people consider the best game ever made, or at least one of the best games made, especially in the last, in modern times and in the last 10 or 15 years. And we have a bunch of other games too. So let's talk about all of them. So released already this year, games that I've heard in the Game of the Year conversation are Hi-Fi Rush, Jedi Survivor, Resident Evil 4 Remake, Dead Space Remake, and Hogwarts Legacy. Now, out of this, you have, in my opinion, 3 controversial potential conversation pieces, and two that I think deserve the spot, especially. The two remakes are really interesting. Both of these games are true remakes. They are not remasters of the original game, and they just kind of threw them together. Resident Evil 4 being made on the RE engine from scratch and adding a lot of mechanics and just adding a lot from the more modern games into this and refining what was good about it before. I've seen people rave about Resident Evil 4. I tried it out, didn't get super into it, but did generally enjoy it, and I understand why people are putting it here. Dead Space Remake, I played, really enjoyed. I definitely think it deserves to be in this conversation. I don't think it deserves to win, though. I would love to see Dead Space Remake make it into some of the people's like top 10s or maybe even top 5s. Another game that is a true remake. They remade this game in the Snowdrop engine, or the Frostbite engine. I'm always gonna mess those up. Wait, or no, am I messing it up again? Frostbite, yes, the EA engine that DICE uses for Battlefield. And if you know the history of that engine with games like Anthem, Andromeda, and others, it had issues, and it's great. They did a fantastic job with this game. I just don't think it quite steps up to that level of like, this is a winner. This is gonna overtake Tears of the Kingdom, just realistically. Hogwarts Legacy is another interesting one. This is one that is likely going to end up being the best-selling game of the year, right up there. It could easily beat out Tears of the Kingdom. But what's interesting is that if the critical reception was mired by a lot of people saying that critics didn't like it because of the controversy with J.K. Rowling and stuff. But what I saw from reviewers I think tend to be pretty neutral and don't care about that kind of stuff was that Hogwarts Legacy as a game has sold extremely well because there is a insane number of Harry Potter fans who are just excited about a game in their universe and a decent game. But I've not seen anyone truly make the argument that this is like one of the best games of the year, or in the sense of it's pretty and it's probably the best Harry Potter game ever made, but that at the end of the day, it's not anything that revolutionary. It's a game that's mostly gained its popularity off of sales of people who are extremely loyal to an extremely popular franchise. And I don't think you can have a conversation about this game without acknowledging that there was like a lot of hate buys of this game, of people who were really against the proposed not buying of this game, blacklisting it, not wanting to have anything to do with it. There was a lot of people kind of on the opposite side who bought this game, streamed it, portrayed it, as being like this best game ever made, who I don't think really gave a crap about the game. They were just jumping into the culture war side of things, at least here in the States. So it's a game that it deserves accolades for what it's done financially, but I suspect won't really be in the conversation with Tears of the Kingdom. Now, Hi-Fi Rush, I think, is a game that just because it is such an original way of presenting a story in a game, it is a game that it's hard, in my opinion, to argue that it's been talked about as like an indie game or a niche game because it was only $30 and it was on Game Pass and it was shadow dropped. I think that's silly. This is as much of a AAA game as I've played this year. Its production value is amazing. Its art is insane. The music is obviously incredible. The characters are great. The story, I think I already said, was great. It's a good platformer. It's a good game all around. And I really think it has almost zero weaknesses. One of the big weaknesses for these beat style games is that if you don't have rhythm, they can be really difficult. But even this one, you don't have to have good rhythm to beat this game. You can play all the way through it and be terrible at it and still have a good time. Obviously, being skilled at it helps. But Hi-Fi Rush is a game, it's a new IP. It was a huge surprise. At the end of the day, what it leaves me wishing is that Hi-Fi Rush actually got the attention and the marketing that Redfall got. and that maybe Redfall got shadow dropped and was really cheap, and we maybe would have seen Hi-Fi Rush be a $70 game that got a couple months of marketing and really got pumped up. So I think that was kind of a mess up by Xbox and their whole deal there, but it is what it is. This is a game I think is almost a lock to be on a lot of people's top fives, and I think that there will be publications that will give Hi-Fi Rush Game of the Year. Jedi Survivor is the last of the released games that I think will at least be in this conversation. It's a game that has done well despite its performance and its release date. It was really interesting with this game coming out at the same time as Redfall, where Redfall is kind of a game in a bad state that also seems like it's just kind of a bad game, where Jedi Survivor is a really, really, really good game in most ways that released in a bad state. And when you see the way these two games were released, I played both of them. I beat Jedi Survivor. I played Redfall for a short time and then will never touch it again. It's just interesting how you can be so much more forgiving of a game when you can tell it's really good, when you can tell it's got good bones, which Survivor does, especially as it gets fixed up. And I think opinions kind of forget about the rough release state. You're going to see people at least propose this game as Game of the Year. The characters are great, the story's incredible, the graphics are beautiful, the environments are amazing. It's just, the combat is so fun. The platforming, this might be my favorite platformer I've ever played, is Jedi Survivor. And that's crazy because you're a guy. Like, that shouldn't be the best platformer, but it's right up there. And I think that it is really, really cool what they did with this game. Respawn gets Star Wars, I think. And it just, I don't know, it was really exciting. It's a great game. I think this absolutely deserves, and much like Hi-Fi Rush, I wouldn't be surprised if we see outlets give Survivor Game of the Year. I don't expect it to be any of the big ones. I think that's still leaning towards tiers. Now, when we talk about games that could maybe become Game of the Year instead of Tears of the Kingdom, we also talk about games that are upcoming. So the ones that were notable, and there's more than this list, but I think are worth really considering, are Diablo 4, Street Fighter 6, Final Fantasy 16, Starfield, Spider-Man 2, some random indie darling we haven't even heard of yet, and maybe Hellblade: Senua's Saga. That one's kind of a tough one because I suspect that here in a couple weeks after the Xbox show, we'll know if that game is coming or not. There's been rumors that Xbox is planning on having one more big release this year. They have Forza Motorsport coming up, then Starfield. There is a lot of chatter that there may be something else by the end of the year, but it could run into early next year. And the most likely candidate for that would be Hellblade: Senua's Saga, the sequel to Senua's Sacrifice. So Diablo 4, I think, is a game, it's been testing really well. The betas for it have been extremely well received. I've really, really enjoyed them. I haven't cared about a Diablo game since 2. And I think that this game, it's really going to depend on if the Blizzard tax takes it down enough for people to not be willing to give it its flowers completely. But I absolutely think Diablo 4, assuming the entire game and the full experience of it lives up to what they've shown so far, I think it has to be in that conversation. And again, will probably be another game that will at least get some, maybe smaller publications, given that it's due. Street Fighter 6, I think, is going to come out. This is if you don't pay attention to fighting games, I personally could care less about them. But if you just pay attention to gaming news and stuff, you'll know that this year is working up to be maybe one of the best years in fighting games ever. There is an insane number of fighting games that are coming out this year. I think most notably Street Fighter 6. I'm also not in that world, so maybe people think other games are more notable than that. I think this game's going to get tons of accolades, or it's going to get a lot of attention. I think much like how Forza Horizon 5 a couple years ago probably should have been Game of the Year, but it suffered that racing game tax. I think Street Fighter does this as well. I don't think you're going to see any big publications, especially, and probably no one other than maybe like a fighting game website, give Street Fighter their Game of the Year. Even though I think it's probably going to be really good, it wouldn't surprise me at all if it is one of the games on this list that scores up in the 90s of Metacritic, especially because the people who review it are probably mostly going to be fighting game fans and publications. So I think this is one that will probably actually be left out of this conversation, but very well may deserve it if all things were considered equally. Final Fantasy 16, I mean, I don't think there's much to say about it. It's Final Fantasy. These games don't come around super often. People are extremely loyal to this brand and have a lot of hype for this. All of the preview stuff I've seen about this and people's takes on it have been very positive. It seems like they're continuing to make the Final Fantasy franchise a little more action based and getting away from the turn-based combat and all of that of yore. And I think that it will probably be in this conversation, especially if it hits as it should. But I still think it's probably, you don't want to call a game niche. That's probably going to sell better than most games this year. But I just would be surprised if it reached a state where it could really take over Tears or maybe some of these other games. Starfield, I think, is a really interesting one. I think it's almost kind of like a black sheep on this list. People know Bethesda makes bangers, even when their games are buggy and messed up and never quite up to date technologically. Whenever they release a game, even in people's minds, they think back to Fallout 4. And I think a lot of people have kind of like a mid remembrance of that game. And it has like a high 80s Metacritic score. It's one of the better games ever made, if you look at the big picture. But because it maybe didn't follow up with New Vegas the way people wanted, which was made by a different developer, it maybe didn't follow up or advance the Fallout 3 formula as much as maybe some people wanted. I think maybe it suffered because of that, but it's still a fantastic game. And basically, besides Fallout 76, which at best was kind of a spin-off or side venture for Bethesda, and maybe shouldn't be looked at as one of their main releases, I think that Starfield is gonna be a game that probably deserves to get a rating up in the 90s, may get one in the 80s, and it's just really going to depend on how it fulfills what people want from it. A lot of people are trying to put all this pressure on Starfield of needing to be the savior for Xbox, where I think more realistic people are just wanting it to be the best game it can be and to be what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be Fallout in space. That's what I think most people want. And if it does that well, I think people are going to love it. We'll just have to see how the actual critical reception of it is, because I've seen so many people panning it already, because I think people have found it to be profitable to dig on Xbox and their exclusives. I think Redfall was one that deserved such response, but I think that the picture painted around these games has been skewed in a really weird way, ignoring games like Hi-Fi Rush and others. And I think that even if Starfield was an 11 out of 10, I think it's got a long journey to potentially winning a Game of the Year, especially in a year where we have Tears of the Kingdom coming out and kicking butt. But we'll have to wait and see. Spider-Man 2 is an interesting one. I think this is going to be a game that's going to come out, be super popular. People who love the first one will love the second one. Maybe some new fans will jump on it. I would be amazed if this game, especially this year, is in the conversation for Game of the Year. I fully expect Spider-Man 2 to be Spider-Man 1 with more content and some upgraded visuals and stuff. And it's a game that people really, really love, but I just really don't think it's going to be loved to the point where people are going to say, you know what, all these other games were not as good as this. I think people are going to be like, this was a really great experience. Now I'm going to go play some more Tears of the Kingdom, but we'll have to wait and see. And then finally, I think an indie darling could always pop up. We had something like It Takes Two a few years ago. There's a new Hollow Knight game coming. There's a bunch of these like high profile indie games that are coming, or maybe ones that we've never heard of that could end up doing really well and maybe stealing the show a bit. I think that's a pretty long shot. As I kind of wrap up this whole conversation, I think that the Game of the Year this year is probably Tears of the Kingdoms to lose. I think Tears of the Kingdom is a really interesting situation where, if you've listened to my podcast or checked out my short that I made about it, is Tears of the Kingdom is interesting because it's on a platform that everyone knows is outdated and is kind of bad. You're seeing most streamers and stuff playing the game illegally. And I know there's been some like pushback on that. The streamers, you can, if you own a game, you can emulate it legally. if it's unmodified. Most of the streamers I've seen are playing a fairly heavily modified version of the game to make it actually work on PCs. And as far as I know, that is super illegal because you have modified their IP. And I think when you see that streamers are having to, play this game emulated to even play it on stream, when you for someone on the outside who hasn't had a Nintendo console since the Game Boy Color, I watch a game that looks like it has probably the best open world, choose your own path possibilities of any game ever made. But then I also see this super high budget game that's been in development forever that has like very little to no voice acting. That the voice acting is abysmal. It's bad, especially for one of the main characters. And no one cares about that stuff because the gameplay is the best gameplay of any game maybe ever made, and I can even tell that from watching people play it. And so it's an interesting thing that can any of these other games that we talked about today be so good in general, or maybe have a specific thing they're super good at enough to sway enough people to pick one of them over Tears of the Kingdom. And I think both because of legit objective reasons and maybe some subjective biases and stuff like that, I think that it's going to be a pretty tough thing to beat. I suspect Tears of the Kingdom is probably already the game of the year for 2023. I would love for any of these other games to surprise us, to be such a big hit that they do surpass Tears of the Kingdom in hype and notoriety. I am not expecting it though, for better or for worse. So that's all I have for this one. Please leave a comment down below with what you think on whether any of these games, or maybe a game I didn't mention, can maybe compete with Tears of the Kingdom. If you think Tears of the Kingdom just deserves it, I'd be curious to why. I'm curious for takes that are more informed than my own. So if you like this video, if you want to see more, please subscribe to the channel. If you liked it as well, please hit the like button. Leave a comment down below. You can find me on other places all over the internet as Bondiesel, including Twitter, Twitch, Instagram, and right here on YouTube. And if you want to listen to a weekly news and speculation podcast about gaming, check out the EchoCast on all podcast platforms and right here on YouTube. That's all I have for this one. So until next time.